design, marriage, family, child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is a Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to be talking about the state of California. A couple of reasons. First of all, those wildfires out there right now have got our attention, but we're going to be talking about this book that I mentioned yesterday, The California Left Coast Survivor's Guide, and it's very reminiscent of some of the material that we've mentioned in the past on the politically incorrect guide to the Bible, politically incorrect guide to Islam, whatever it might be, and so it has something to do with that. Also reminds us a lot of the Babylon Bee. By the way, the lead story today in the Babylon Bee, the guy who said Facebook was not suppressing free speech announces Facebook will stop suppressing free speech. So those of you that love, again, Babylon Bee will certainly love our conversation. But whether you live in California or not, many of the things we're going to be talking about with Tim really are relevant to your situation as well. Because as we've said, they oftentimes make the case that what happens in Las Vegas stays in Vegas, but what happens in California spreads across the nation, and whether you live in a blue state or a red state, or maybe even in a red state have a blue city, many of the things we're going to talk about certainly are happening in your community, and if nothing else, this is a cautionary tale. Tim Anaya is the Vice President of Marketing and Communications for the wonderful organization out there in California, the Pacific Research Institute. It's really had kind of a front row on California policy making for the last quarter century. He also is the co-host of the Next Round podcast. We have information about Pacific Research Institute and the podcast there as well. Has worked around the state capitol as a communications director, worked for a variety of individuals, some that you would recognize, the future House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, even was a speech writer for, at that time, the Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. So, Tim, welcome to Point of View.
Kerby, it's great to be with you.
Actually, I was going to eventually get to wildfires, but I realized, in some respects, well, that's really your second chapter. So let's get there, because we are already having people say, yes, a wildfire in California is something that is a natural phenomenon, but there are things we can do with fire management. We can even maybe spend less time, as one individual said, talking about diversity and trying to make sure we have enough water in the reservoirs. So in some respects, your Left Coast Survivor's Guide is really a way to dip into some of the issues in the news right today, isn't it?
That's right. And, what was scary was, coincidentally, yesterday, my colleague and I were down there. We were doing some filming in the Venice area, which, if your listeners aren't familiar with the geography of greater L.A., that's kind of, when you see Muscle Beach and the famous, kind of beaches of L.A., that's right there. And that's maybe 5 or 6 miles from where the fires broke out. So we went to a coffee shop. We were killing time in the morning before we did our filming, and literally within the half hour of when we went into the coffee shop, we saw the fire break out. And it was, I took a little video of it on my phone. I've never seen anything that big grow that fast.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you hear them say it spread like wildfires, now I know what they mean. We really could see it with our eyes. And it was an eerie day down there. We could hear all the sirens in the background. You could hear, I don't know if they have them across the country, but in California, you get these emergency alerts on your phone that blare. They were going off all throughout our filming. And flying home, we flew home last night. It was 100-mile-an-hour wind gusts. I've never been on a plane, and we were at LAX, I've never been on a plane where the plane was shaking at the gate, wasn't even moving.
Wow.
And it was probably the worst 10 or 15 minutes taking off I've ever had on a flight. But you're exactly right. When you talk about policy, policy didn't cause the fires, but government policy and what Gavin Newsom calls the California way, it's making them worse, and it probably is going to make the recovery worse as well.
Well, and even so, I've grown up in California. As a matter of fact, born in Berkeley and lived in the California area when it was still the Golden State. My father ran for California Assembly on 2 separate occasions, and things turned around, interesting enough, in 1966 when this guy by the name of Ronald Reagan won governorship. But up until that time, it was very different. But having worked, for example, with PG&E, you even have a section here about power lines and the rest. And really, in some respects, the Survivor's Guide, although it's tongue well placed in cheek and you're having a lot of fun, it's also a tale of if you do go to California, you're going to have to pay attention to some things because a drugstore that you're hoping to go to might not exist because the crime rate is so high they've closed it down. You might want to go to a place where I used to grow up around Oakland and go to In-N-Out. Well, that's closed down because of crime. Or you may want to find a way to put gas in your car or to power up your electric car and find out there aren't as many of those stations. In some respects, as you work your way through this book, you recognize that obviously you're having a little bit of fun pointing out some of the policy problems, but it does make a visit to California a little more stressful than it would have been just a few years ago, don't you think?
That's right. Yeah, it certainly, in some respects it's a warning for those of you thinking about coming to visit California, or God forbid, if you're the rare person who reverse out migrates and comes into California, there's a lot of things that you may not be expecting that you're going to have to deal with. But in many respects, we kind of wrote the book. Obviously, we wrote it in the midst of last year, and Gavin Newsom, going around the country on his road shows, touting the California way, right? And in many ways, the California way was inspiring politicians like Kamala Harris, and the book, we really thought at the time too, it would be a preview of what would be a Harris administration. And I think people need to understand, that just because President Trump was reelected, it doesn't mean you're out of the woods on these bad policies. Yes, a lot of these things are inspiring bad actions by the Biden administration and bad congressional action, but they're inspiring policy changes at city halls and state capitals across the country too, and even in red states. That's why we wrote it in kind of the wilderness guide. It's like the old scouting manuals, yes. Right? We think we're in the policy wilderness in California. So not only did we want to, give our California friends a good hand, but we wanted to give our friends across the country, a little warning of, hey, these ideas are spreading across the Sierras. And, it's not a boring book. It's not dense in any way. We want to give you, we want to entertain you. You can't be so serious. You gotta laugh at some of these things. They're so crazy, but it gives you in a very readable way. These are the ideas and nuggets and facts and research you need so that when these ideas are proposed in your state, you can stand up and say, California actually has already been there, done that. It didn't work there, and we shouldn't try these ideas here.
Don't need to export it. Let me just mention, as we're going to a break, that first of all, we have information. The book's been out for many months, so you might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have a place where you can get it in hardback, paperback, or Kindle, and I think that would be the simplest way to go. If you'd like to know a little bit more about, of course, the organization that we're talking about today, Pacific Research Institute, it's pacificresearch.org, but, of course, we have that information. We'll come back and talk about some of the environmental issues, energy sense, renewable energy, and what that has done to the state of California. We'll have more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Yesterday, I talked about debanking, which occurs when an individual is denied banking services because of their political stance or business venture. What happens when this happens to a nation? We call this action financial sanctions and have seen many examples of that in the last decade. The U.S. and its allies were able to freeze Russian financial accounts and shut off the Russian central bank's access to hundreds of billions of dollars of foreign reserves. The IMF has been able to suspend the Taliban's access to various funds and financial instruments. As legitimate as these actions might be, punishing Russia for invading Ukraine or punishing the Taliban for terrorist activities, they concern other countries. Will the U.S. or other international agencies one day punish them for a policy they enact? That is why many countries are looking for another currency than the dollar, which right now serves as the world's reserve currency. That is why the BRICS nations have been talking about developing another currency. That is also why they and other nations are turning to Bitcoin. Harvard PhD student Matthew Ferranti argues in his research paper, Hedging Sanction Risk, Cryptocurrency and Central Bank Reserves. These banks have begun to acquire gold and Bitcoin, but he warns they may not be able to collect enough gold and should consider the digital asset of Bitcoin to hedge the risk of sanctions. Why are nation states talking about acquiring Bitcoin? First, they see it as a digital asset. Recently, the Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell referred to Bitcoin as digital gold. Second, they see it as a hedge against sanctions risk. You never know when a nation or an international organization would want to shut down your finances. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of Israel, go to viewpoints.info/Israel. Viewpoints.info/Israel. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Topic today is a California Left Coast Survivor's Guide, a Pacific Research Institute handbook to help the rest of America avoid making the wrong left turn. Let's, we can talk about a couple of issues. Energy and the environment. You have a chapter, obviously, about renewable energy. And as important as wind and solar power would be, it's pretty obvious that if you want to try to provide enough power for the most populous state in the country, you're going to need to do more, and yet there has been an attempt to eliminate anything from fossil fuel to nuclear, and that's an important issue that, again, maybe other states can learn from the experience there in California.
That's right. We hear the left, a term they like to use is intersectionality. And this is one where I think you have a lot of intersectionality at play. So there's, one part of the equation, right, is we want to, and California has led the nation in a bad way in having all of these green mandates. And they go from, we're going to have a requirement that 100% of cars sold in California in 2035 have to be electric vehicles. We're going to ban gas-powered lawn equipment. We're going to ban commercial gas ovens, all of these things. We're going to ban actually gas connections in new residential construction. So you have all of these mandates, and it's the inevitable push for everything has to be electric. Well, that begs the question, are we generating enough electricity to meet the demand? And, of course, the answer is a big no.
No.
And the way that we're going, the other kind of simple solutions, would have more nuclear power, the cleanest form of power, have more natural gas, which is one of the cleanest sources, actually, of generating electricity. We want to phase all these things out. And so what you're going to see, and what PRI has shown in its research and what you're already seeing is Well, number one, if we get in 2045, when we have a mandate, 100% of all power produced in California must come from renewable sources. We are going to be 21% short of the power needed every day to run the grid just from the electric vehicle mandate. That doesn't count the gas. We're going to electric ovens and electric HVAC and all of those sorts of things. So we're going to be in the dark every day if we continue to go down this trend. And there's no shift. There's no realization of, gee, maybe this is unworkable, unrealistic. Maybe it'll take us 50 years to get there. So there's that sort of the realism, right, of we're going to sit in the dark every day. But then there's the cost aspect. And so when you're looking at things like electric rates, we have the highest residential electric rates in the United States. Our average energy burdens are hugely more expensive than the rest of the country, and it's both on gas to drive your car and it's electricity as well. And so then when you have when we're talking about, well, cost of living and quality of life is so important, well, that's a huge part of it. And who's hurt the most? Who's hurt the most are working class people who can ill afford these expensive mandates, and they don't care. That's the thing. When you hear a Gavin Newsom, when you hear his allies in the legislature talk about these things, it's full speed ahead. There's maybe a few of them that have a tough race might straddle the fence a little bit, but gas prices are continually going up. We have a new mandate that just came on board where gas prices could go up another 47 cents a gallon. 47 cents a gallon. But we're full steam ahead on these sorts of things. So it's a cost thing for sure, but the lights may not come on come 2045 every day, because of these mandates.
Let's also talk about that, since you're talking about with the price of gas. You have a whole section here where you talk about all the taxes, most of which are hidden from the consumer. But when you look at the add-ons, again, first pegged at 51 cents, but then by the time you get the add-ons, $1.41, then you just mentioned, of course, 47 cents more because of the Air Resources Board. And so it's no wonder that if you drive to California from another state, you go through sticker shock when you just try to load up your car with just a little bit of gasoline. So then you think, well, this is the state that really has been trying to mandate electric cars. And then if you turn over a few more pages, you point out that across the valley's immense 4,500 square miles, this would be what would be called California's Imperial Valley, which is just north, of course, of the U.S.-Mexico border, and you want to actually power up your electric vehicle, you're only going to find 4 fast charging public stations. This almost looks like a joke, but if you're trying to even drive around in California, it isn't very funny, is it?
No. And, it brings up a point, too, about this is not just residential. These mandates are on businesses, too. We had a conference a few years back where the CEO of the Raley's grocery store chain spoke about the challenges he was facing. And, they're a business. If having green trucks works for them and improves the bottom line and is more efficient, they'll gladly go to that. They invested in all of these green trucks. He said, we had to scrap them all. They don't have the torque to go over the mountains. So if you're putting these requirements where they don't work, they're not going to work for business, can't afford them, they're unworkable. Well, what are we gaining? Why are we doing this? Is this really, is the hope that we're going to improve our emissions by basically having no economic activity in the state? You wonder that sometimes with how these things are going.
Well, you can't export it either, because I'm thinking right now of our listeners in Alaska or North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin. Of course, right now, even in Texas, we're at 20 degrees just the other day. These electric cars and trucks don't work very well in those situations. So it's just, again, a reminder that even if it's not working in California, it's going to work even worse, perhaps, in other parts of the country, just in terms of the environment. But let me keep moving, because there's a whole chapter chapter on no-nos, and I was unaware, even though I've lived in California and my brother's still there, we have family there, banning plastic bags, banning gas-powered lawn equipment, banning generators when obviously you may not have enough electricity, banning natural gas. Yes, you could bake your own bread, but it has to be an electric oven. Essentially banning gas stations, even banning hotel room plastics. You go through this list and you're going, what is allowed in the state of California?
Yeah, you wonder that some days, right? The one on the hotel, bottles, that to me is the silliest thing. And
that one got my wife.
No one was clamoring.
Yes. When I read that to her, she says, what? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no one's clamoring for this, right? It's, there's no study that said this was a problem. There was no movement. And by the way, Marriott doesn't need government to enact a mandate for them to swap out what they provide in their guest room bathrooms, right? They can have, if they want to have the little dispensers in the showers, go for it. Well, didn't we learn from COVID, right? There's a lot of bacteria in those things. Are those the most sanitary things to do? But also, it's great for the economy too, right? I don't know about you, but all the time you get to try out new products that, gee, I like that shampoo. I'm going to buy a bottle of that when I come home. That's out the window now, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, it's those. We have so many other problems facing the state of California, real and in often cases policymaker created. Why are we spending time on things like we're going to ban little hotel shampoo bottles? I mean, it just is so silly. Now, some of these, though, they're very serious. When you talk about the gas-powered lawn equipment, that's not just yes, the technology's there for the residential side. Technology doesn't exist really on the commercial side. So, your landscaping company, it's a huge undertaking to have to go to this, and will it even work? So there's that, but it's also, it is hurting entrepreneurship, and primarily for Latino entrepreneurs who start their way up the pathway to the American dream by starting a lawn care business and hiring, largely Spanish-speaking immigrants. You're taking away those opportunities for the American dream with this mandate, and there's no care, no awareness, no thought about it at all. It's the adherence to this, the jobs that are going to be lost, who cares about that? The commercial gas oven ban in Southern California, it's forecast that's going to cost 4,000 jobs. And that's people, the commercial kitchens, right, they make the bread for restaurants and the cakes for restaurants and grocery stores and such. So
that's right.
Those are real jobs, real small businesses, and a real inconvenience. It's inconvenience, it's cost, but these are people's livelihoods we're affecting. This isn't just a fad we're forcing everybody to do. These are people's livelihoods on the line.
Talking about the California Left Coast Survivor's Guide. When we come back, we'll talk about entrepreneurs, minimum wage, and maybe a little bit on the subject of education. All that coming up right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation with Tim Anaya as we talk about the book that he has co-authored with Kerry Jackson, The California Left Coast Survivor's Guide, the Pacific Research Institute Handbook to help the rest of America avoid making a wrong left turn. Where there are actually about 16 chapters there. We also, of course, have a link to pacificresearch.org. If you scroll down, you'll see there's an interview that is posted there that Lance Izumi's been on the program with us many times before, talking about the great classroom collapse. One of the chapters here is something we'll get to in just a few minutes about not letting a great education system fall off the cliff. But Tim, one of the things you were talking about is this issue of entrepreneurs. And this is not just a California issue. As a matter of fact, we've been following, for example, what has happened when we've raised the minimum wage very, very high in places like Seattle, Washington, and other places. But in an attempt to so-called do good, what it ends up doing is affecting so many of the fast foods and so many of these entry-level jobs, maybe at a supermarket. And it sounds good until you see the devastation that it has. And that's one of the chapters in your book as well, isn't it?
That's right. You know, we're the epicenter of the push for minimum wage. Certainly, California just enacted in recent months a $20 per hour minimum wage for fast food workers. And we've seen, it's inevitable what's going to happen from that. Restaurants, it's very difficult to make a restaurant go. The profit margins are very thin. They really take it from all sides, right? As far as cost pressures and regulatory, they're dealing with it all, energy, food costs, all of those sorts of things. And so we've seen that, despite Governor Newsom bragging about it, if you look at the seasonally adjusted labor figures, California lost 5,000 jobs over the period, when this law was first being enacted last year. And so why would we do that? That's opportunities for people to make a good living. Maybe it's a first job. Maybe it's someone making extra money. Maybe it's someone retired needs to make a few extra dollars. But, why would we do that? Why would we go out of our way to not only, take away opportunities for people to work, but you're also making, a critical food source, food sold at fast food restaurants, very, it's not quick and cheap and expensive anymore. The other thing, too, where California, I think, really has been a leader in a bad way, and you saw it inspire national policy, is the issue of entrepreneurship when it comes to gig work. We passed a law a few years ago that was called AB 5, right? And my colleague and co-author, Kerry Jackson, called it perhaps the cruelest legislation ever enacted, and it basically denied your opportunity to work as you wish. So much of work in California, so much of the future of work, right? It's creativity. It's not a 9-to-5 job. It's not where an employee clocking in. In many cases, it's not you're going to an office, right? You're working. Our office right now, we're in a co-working space. We don't have, an office. There's creative people. Every one of my neighbors here is some creative person, right? It's not the old, you're a union worker economy. And if that works for you, great. But that's the Newsom vision. That's the California way, is that everybody has to be a 9-to-5 union employee where the whistle bell is going off for the break and lunchtime and 5 o'clock. And so that law has denied so many opportunities for people to work as they wish. We were talking about minority entrepreneurship earlier. It's been terrible, taking away opportunities for minority entrepreneurs. And that has been one of the key things in the Biden administration that they've tried to take national. There was a law called the PRO Act, a proposal that they've been pushing in Congress, and then the Biden administration on the regulatory front. Now, all that's going to go out the window on January 20th, but those laws are being pushed in other states. There are several states where those are being proposed. So that's one of the things from my book that if you pay attention to one thing, pay attention to that entrepreneurship chapter, because that law, that kind of line of thinking, that is spreading across the country. And that may be a proposal coming to your state or your city. And I think everyone needs to be vigilant about that, because entrepreneurship is the American dream. It is the American economy. It is how we climb the economic ladder. If you don't have a vibrant entrepreneurial society, you're not going to have a very strong country.
Well, again, if you want to create jobs, most of them are created by entrepreneurs. And let's just stay on AB5 for just another minute or two, because, first of all, who did it hurt? Well, bartenders, bookkeepers, construction workers, nurses, paralegals, pharmacists, on and on and on. But then it was unfair because who got off scot-free? Oh, that'd be people that are involved in providing music or entertainment, home inspectors, brokers, media professionals. In other words, the ones that could get some exemptions there. So first of all, it is unfair. But second of all, back to the point you're making, because you have a section here on AB5 as a thief stealing opportunities from what? Communities of color and from low-income workers. It also robs workers of their freedom of choice, and in some respects has even led to some of the trucks not rolling down the road. And that's the way we get our food and all of our services. So the impact is even greater than I think some people would imagine unless they were to read Chapter 10 of your book.
That's right, and people forget that. The big truck drivers, right? Most of those are independent contractors. And, there's been huge, and there's continues to be litigation on truckers, and do they have to comply with the provisions of AB5. But that's exactly right. And all those industries, by the way, those people who were exempt from the law, those were people who they had a cozy relationship with the union and got an okay from the union to be exempted. In fact, the author of the bill, who now has become the president of the California Labor Federation, allegedly when people were coming and seeking changes to the language of the bill, they said they actually had slips you had to get signed by the union leadership to be okay to put that, before they'd even consider putting those provisions in the bill. But you're exactly right. It's the politically connected, the politically powerful people who could spend a lot of money on lobbyists who were able to get themselves exempted from the bill. I think the other key point on this, too, is that bit about choice, right?
Yes.
It's, government and a lot of, I think if there's another overarching theme of the book, right, it's government trying to dictate, how you live your life, what kind of job you have, what are the desired industries that government wants in California. And I think this is another way along those lines. But innovation isn't dictated by government. The next creative thing isn't dictated by government. And if you have all these, we're fitting all these people in a little square box, you need innovation to make the green economy work. In and of itself, having green things aren't a bad thing, but you're going to need more innovation to make it work. And you're not going to get that when you're hindering people's ability to work as they wish, create as they wish, innovate as they wish. Last thing I'd say about it, too, is remember when this law was enacted in California, it came at the worst time. It came on the onset of the pandemic. So not only was this taking away your opportunity to work as you wish, you needed to work at home in the pandemic because California was closed down for a year and a half. So not only is it stifling creativity and innovation, it really hurt people who needed to work, do gig work to provide for their families.
I'm going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into the issue of education. But since you did mention the pandemic, that chapter is, again, a reminder of what was actually taking place in California and how many times during 2020 and 2021, but especially 2020, where we would see people being arrested for being out on the beach by themselves. And, again, the tighter reins, as you point out, did not significantly improve outcomes. And at first, you could certainly be understanding the fact that we didn't know the nature of this infectious disease. So you could see why some of the draconian kinds of measures that were being proposed, not only at the federal level, but even in like the state of California, might have been justified. But the more the evidence came in, the more it was very clear that this was doing great harm to young people, which we'll talk about after the break in terms of what was happening in the schools. the harm that it did to businesses, but also just the way in which we sort of felt like we were living in this totalitarian state. And that, I think, is just another very sad chapter. But when we come back, I do want to talk about this whole educational system, because having grown up there and having at least some of my academic background in California, I remember when those particular educational performances and even the ability of students graduating from high school in California usually were at the very top of the nation. And that's not the case any longer. And so how did this educational system in the state of California almost fall off a cliff? We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention the book again, The California Left Coast Survivor's Guide. If you'd like to know more about the Pacific Research Institute, you can go to the website. If you'd like to get this book on hardback, paperback, or Kindle, we have that there. Might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we've made it very easy for you to find. And Tim, I thought for just a few minutes we might talk about education, because as I mentioned in this article and this chapter 12, it talks about the fact that really at one time California's K through 12 schools and, of course, the public colleges and universities were the nation's best. And yet, as you point out, it has been taken over by political activists, and we've traded, if you will, the three R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, for three different R's: racism, redistribution, and revolution. And we are not producing the same level of excellence from the schools in California. And that, I think, is, again, just a very sad commentary and a cautionary tale to listeners in other states around the country.
That's right. I mean, really, all that we're talking about here, especially on the economy, right, it comes down to, do we have a trained, skilled, creative workforce, not only to meet today's demands, but to meet the demands of the future? And, yes, California schools were once the envy of the world. This is, not only is this where you want to be in so many areas, but we have the workforce to back it up on agriculture, on entertainment, on technology, science, biotech, all those things, right? Not only do we innovated those things here because we had that trained, skilled, creative workforce. And now you look at our schools, right? There's so much discussion of the politicization of curriculum, focus on all of the, all these, kind of extracurricular obsessions that politicians like Governor Newsom have. But the proof is in the pudding. And you look at it, we have among the worst reading test scores in the country. We have among the worst math test scores in the country. When we talk about, we want to overcome, past injustices, why don't we have enough African-American students in UC and CSU? Well, listen to what Janet Napolitano, former secretary, former governor of Arizona, who served as the president of the UC system for a while, she said it's because California's public schools are failing to prepare students of color to meet the entrance requirements for CSU and UC. Well, the issue isn't lower standards, let's not teach algebra in the 8th grade, let's have a kind of equalization. We need to have more rigor. We need to make sure that the reading methods that we're using are effective. We need to make sure that we're teaching students math and teaching math early. And these aren't partisan issues, right? You see many Democrats across the country. There's a debate over what we call the science of reading, which is the proper way to teach reading, more phonics-based, proven scientifically. You're seeing Governor Hochul in New York and many Democrats across the country are embracing these methods because they know we need to have our kids read. We need to have our kids know how to do math. We do need to close the achievement gap. And it's not political correctness and all of these kind of PC woke ideas that are going to do it. It's the tried and the true. So when we have all these debates and you hear all these debates on, kind of these cultural issues and woke issues that are creeping into the classroom, really all the discussion should go back to, well, what have you done to help your students succeed? What have you done to help your students achieve? And if you're not doing your basic job, teaching your kids to read and write and be able to do math and understand scientific concepts, well, what are you doing? And I think you're seeing Californians and people in other states with the growth in homeschooling, with the growth in people choosing other school choice options, they're voting with their feet. They're saying, and they saw in the pandemic how bad it was. They saw Zoom school. They saw the crazy things their children were learning. And it, yes, it violated their values, but it also was, you're not teaching our kids to be able to get a job, to be able to succeed in life and whatever they want to do.
And as you point out, they're voting with their feet. They're voting with their pocketbook. And so in some cases, if they remain in the state of California, they're looking for educational options. But also one section of your book, California's most competitive industry, moving vans. And that is right. Unfortunately horrible. And again, this comes from Los Angeles Times. Whole swaths of residents are considering packing up and leaving. And so again, we can lament how California was once once the Golden State and the land of opportunity that has certainly changed dramatically. But I know, Tim, you and Kerry wrote this in part not only to lament where California was, but to warn other states, other mayors, other governors, and even the nation about some of the failed policies. And so in some respects, whether you're in the state of California or not, or whether you're planning on visiting California and having access to this survivor's guide, in some respects this is for everybody, because you have just an incredible catalog, and we didn't even talk about the price of houses and homelessness and all sorts of other issues. These all sort of catalog what's been going on in California, and you need not take these same policies and implement them in your state or even in your city, because we know what the consequences will be, won't we?
That's right. And that's what I said earlier. When these ideas come up, right, you have now with our book, you can, the folks out there can say, hey, California's done this and it hasn't worked, and we don't want to bring these failed ideas here. Let's look at what's actually working. Let's focus on outcomes. We don't want to just throw money at something like Gavin Newsom is fond of doing. We want actually proven results. And so hopefully our book, in some ways, we haven't given up on California. We want it to be, hopefully we can inspire a turnaround, right? And that, we look at these bad numbers, the shame that, we lost population for 3 years in a row. That's something that every politician in this state should be taking as a mark of shame. And we should be, saying, what are we doing wrong? What can we do to turn things around? I think if you look at this book, these are the things that we need to stop doing, and it offers the ideas of how can we turn things around, how can we do things in a better way.
Well, Tim, I appreciate you taking the time to join us for an hour today. I thank you for writing the book. And again, if people want to know more about the Pacific Research Institute, we have a link on our website. So thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
I enjoyed the discussion, Kerby, very much.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I'm pretty sure we're going to be talking about immigration, because the House did pass the Laken-Riley Act. We'll talk about what that means in terms of now the vote going to the United States Senate. Let me just real quickly mention that we do have a link to the Pacific Research Institute. It's very simple. You just simply go to pacificresearch.org. You can find everything right there. Of course, we have information about the book, The California Left Coast Survivor's Guide. And just before we take a break, let me also mention that we'll be actually bringing to you in the next couple of days here a number of action items, and one of those we'll be talking about in the next hour, that you can independently contact your 2 United States senators, but we'll certainly provide that later in the week. But also, let me hold this up. This is our brochure for our trip to Greece. I usually have been mentioning that in the second hour, but I know some of you don't necessarily hear the second hour of Point of View, so I thought I'd mention again, due to some circumstances, we do have some open spots which are still available on the one bus that we take around. Then, of course, we're going to be on a ship as well. This is an opportunity to go to Athens and Corinth and Philippi and Thessalonica, but also we're going to go to Ephesus and Patmos, as well as some of the Greek Isles. And if you are interested at all, just let us know. It will be taking place May 17th to the 27th. And so we would certainly like to have you join us in our trip to Greece as we follow the journeys of Paul and John. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about immigration, talk a little bit about the criminal justice system, get into a variety of other topics that I think are relevant. And again, as a program note, let me just mention tomorrow is our Millennial Roundtable. I'm hoping that will come off. We are going to experience a little bit of a snow drift. And for those of you in the upper Midwest or our listeners in Alaska, you better be rolling your eyes, I know. But nevertheless, we'll see whether that's a problem. It may not be at all, but nevertheless, just thought I'd mention that briefly because I want to get into a couple of issues. And the first article that we've posted today by James Lynch, and it could be from anybody, but that's the one I picked, points out that yesterday the House of Representatives passed the Laken-Riley Act. Now, if you're not familiar with that, it was introduced before, and let's give credit where credit was due. It was first introduced by Representative Mike Collins, who is a Republican from the state of Georgia. Of course, that makes a great deal of sense because of the death of Laken-Riley at the hands of an individual that was here illegally. And as a result, what this piece of legislation would do is require federal agents to detain anyone who is here illegally, an illegal immigrant, an illegal migrant, an undocumented worker, whatever phrase you feel comfortable using, if they are suspected of committing nonviolent crimes. And of course, you would think that there would already be a willingness to detain those individuals who have committed violent crimes. And you would be naive to think that every governor and every mayor would want even to go along with that. So it, I think, illustrates the pushback that's probably going to happen in the next couple of weeks as a person like Tom Homan, who will be the border czar, begins to deport individuals after, of course, Donald Trump, in less than 2 weeks, puts his hand on the Bible, takes the oath of office, and becomes the next president of the United States. The vote is significant, and this is why I'm thinking it might be an action item. We'll see how we go here, because the House voted 264 to 159 to pass the Laken-Riley Act. That means that you had 48 Democrats in the House of Representatives that believed that if an individual is here illegally and has committed a crime, that the federal enforcement agencies should detain him. This is in the category, I would think, pretty close of a no-brainer. Nevertheless, that means that, interestingly enough, you had 159 Democrats who said, no, we couldn't actually support that piece of legislation. And, of course, if you're not familiar, Laken-Riley was the Georgia nursing student who was murdered last year by, of course, this illegal immigrant. And, in a sense, the House has passed it in an overwhelmingly bipartisan manner. And Mike Collins, who is the one that first introduced the legislation last year, actually said that no family should have to go through what Laken's family has endured. And, of course, they passed it last year. And, of course, as you well know, it went nowhere. So now he says it's now up to the Senate to work together to put this crucial legislation on President Trump's desk. Now, last Congress, you had 37 Democrats joined Republicans in voting for the Laken-Riley Act. So let's give credit to the fact that now you have 48, so the number has increased. That's helpful. But you also have to know that now it goes to the Senate. Now, the Senate has enough votes just among the Republicans. You have John Cornyn, excuse me, goes back a few generations. John Cornyn, who is the senator from the state of Texas, who has been counting names, votes, and everything, and assures everyone that all 52 Republicans will vote for this. And it could be 53, but as we've pointed out, we're still waiting for the governor of West Virginia, so 52. Now, in order to actually move ahead to break filibuster, you need 60. So that means you need 8 Democrats in the United States Senate. Now, the good news is that even though you have the Republicans controlling the Senate, they have to work with the Democrats. And the good news is, as far as I can determine, we can identify at least 2 of the necessary 8 that have actually picked up this legislation. And again, let's give credit where credit is due. That would be Democrats John Fetterman from Pennsylvania, and Gary Peters from Michigan. So now we're looking for 6 more Democrats who would actually do the voting. And let's again, John Fetterman has surprised me more than once, but here is what he said on X the other day. That is, ICE, Customs and Immigration, have reported tens of thousands of migrants with criminal records, homicide or sexual assault. 425,000 have criminal records in total and should be deported. I support a secure border. I support a legal path for dreamers. I support the Laken-Riley Act. So that is the case. So if you want to, even before we put up any kind of action item, congratulate, if you have a Republican senator, for their support, you could certainly do that. If you want to congratulate at least 2 Democrats, John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, Gary Peters of Michigan. But those of you that are in states where we have to pick up at least 6 more, you might write them as well. For those of you in the state of Alabama, let's give high praise to Senator Katie Britt. She is the one right now leading this in the Republican Senate, and as a result is somebody that has been working really hard to do that. Also, let's also mention that there's companion legislation that, along with, of course, the one I just mentioned by John Fetterman or Gary Peters, there's one from Senate Majority Leader John Thune, who's the Republican in South Dakota, and Ted Budd, who's on the program with us the other day, who's a Republican from North Carolina. So the Senate is expected to vote on Friday on the Laken-Riley Act. Now, it's not a vote on up or down. It's really a vote on whether or not we have the 60 votes necessary to overcome the filibuster. So we'll see where that goes. But again, Senator Britt put it this way: the American people did not just deliver a mandate on November 5th, they delivered a verdict. They made it clear they want to remove criminal, illegal aliens and protect American families. She went on to say, we will soon know whether Democrats hear, respect, or obey that verdict. Congress has an obligation to Laken, her family, and to families in every corner of our country to do everything in our power to help prevent this type of tragedy from occurring again. I might just mention that a number of years ago, and this was back in 2018, so it goes back a little bit, here I'm holding up my booklet on a biblical point of view on immigration. And it looks at both aspects, both the fact that we should treat individuals that are here, whether they're here legally or illegally, with respect, but also we should respect the rule of law. So I think it really helps understand both biblical principles, and we'll probably update this one, especially in light of some of the legislation and even this issue of deportation that will be in the future. But if you don't already have a way to kind of think through from a biblical point of view this issue of immigration, let me commend this booklet to you. I'll be glad to send it to you, and we'll take a break and get into some other very important issues right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Yesterday, I talked about debanking, which occurs when an individual is denied banking services because of their political stance or business venture. What happens when this happens to a nation? We call this action financial sanctions and have seen many examples of that in the last decade. The U.S. and its allies were able to freeze Russian financial accounts and shut off the Russian central bank's access to hundreds of billions of dollars of foreign reserves. The IMF has been able to suspend the Taliban's access to various funds and financial instruments. As legitimate as these actions might be, punishing Russia for invading Ukraine or punishing the Taliban for terrorist activities, they concern other countries. Will the U.S. or other international agencies one day punish them for a policy they enact? That is why many countries are looking for another currency than the dollar, which right now serves as the world's reserve currency. That is why the BRICS nations have been talking about developing another currency. That is also why they and other nations are turning to Bitcoin. Harvard PhD student Matthew Ferranti argues in his research paper, Hedging Sanction Risk, Cryptocurrency and Central Bank Reserves. These banks have begun to acquire gold and Bitcoin, but he warns they may not be able to collect enough gold and should consider the digital asset of Bitcoin to hedge the risk of sanctions. Why are nation states talking about acquiring Bitcoin? First, they see it as a digital asset. Recently, the Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell referred to Bitcoin as digital gold. Second, they see it as a hedge against sanctions risk. You never know when a nation or an international organization would want to shut down your finances. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of Israel, go to viewpoints.info/Israel. Viewpoints.info/Israel. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. But I thought for just a minute, those of you watching online, I'll hold up my Babylon Bee cup. We had some debate. I remember when Steve Miller, my producer, went to one of the Babylon Bee events. I thought he brought this cup back from them, but I'm thinking maybe now I've ordered it. But either way, we want to salute Babylon Bee for this reason, because if you haven't seen it, the lead story today for Babylon Bee, which again has a lot of fun poking fun at individuals, as a picture of Mark Zuckerberg, the guy who said Facebook was not suppressing free speech, announces Facebook will stop suppressing free speech. That's a great line, and it may be the best line of the day, because what has happened since Mark Zuckerberg has posted that is there has been an avalanche of articles pro and con about what he had to say. I did cover it yesterday, but I thought it would be worthwhile to just mention it, because the theme that we sort of are working our way through this week has been the issue of censorship. My commentary yesterday was on debanking. That's when an individual has denied banking services because of their political stance or their business venture, and we gave examples from the past, more recent ones even out of Silicon Valley. My commentary today is about financial sanctions, and that one relates in a sense to the idea of debanking, but at the nationwide level, in which, of course, after Russia invaded Ukraine, we certainly saw the need, or at least this administration saw the need, to freeze some of the financial assets of Russia. At the same time, IMF has been able to suspend the access of the Taliban to various funds and financial instruments. And again, these may be legitimate, that is, punishing Russia for invading Ukraine, certainly punishing the Taliban for terrorist activities. But the impact has been that other countries have wondered, what kind of censorship is going to happen to our finances if indeed we find ourselves on the wrong side of one of these powerful agencies like the IMF or the federal government of the United States or whatever it might be? And I'll give you a preview. My commentary for Friday is actually entitled Ending Censorship, in which we're talking about, at that time, some of the individuals that Donald Trump has nominated for the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, maybe the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, even the head of the NIH, not to mention, of course, the head of of Health and Human Services, Robert Kennedy, all are kind of addressing that issue of censorship. So certainly this is kind of a theme that sort of runs through this week. But just for a minute, I thought we'd come back to the requirements that Mark Zuckerberg have actually implemented, in which he said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do what we can to prevent having so many of these fact checkers. We're going to end up doing a program with community notes, very similar to what X, formerly known as Twitter, has been doing. And as I pointed out to a couple of individuals that we were doing a back and forth on email comments, perhaps the most significant thing from Mark Zuckerberg was this. Those individuals that will be kind of monitoring this issue of speech, we're going to move them from California to Texas. Now, we just the last hour, of course, talked with Tim Anaya about the California Left Coast Survivors Guide, but even more so recognize that if you live in Palo Alto, the Silicon Valley area, you are living in a bubble where everybody pretty much reinforces your ideas. Most of the people at Stanford will agree with your leftist ideas, except maybe those at the Hoover Institution there, where Victor Davis Hanson and others are. Most of the people in the community are going to agree with you. And so in some respects, he's recognized that, Silicon Valley isn't necessarily representative of America. You think? And so it's kind of interesting that not only is he going to change how they monitor speech, but even the location of the people who will be monitoring some of that speech. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that all of this is done because he really is convinced that he needs to change what he's doing, but as some people are starting to say, he felt the need to go and kiss the ring of Donald Trump. Whether that's the case or not, that's the kind of editorial statements that are coming out now in not only the New York Times. Meta says fact checkers were the problem. Fact checkers rule that false. Meta ends fact checking, drawing praise from Trump. One's from the New York Times, one's from the Washington Post. And then if you look at the letters to the editor, there are people that just are so angry and frustrated, and many of them simply state bluntly, you don't have any free speech, at least not when you're on a social media site. And in some respects, they're partially right, because the First Amendment doesn't apply to you. It applies to the government. But when the government has been fiddling with that and actually working all sorts of content moderation, that is indeed the case. So nevertheless, it is interesting to see the hue and cry and really some of the anger that has surfaced over the last 24, almost 48 hours, since some of these announcements have come out, in particular over the last about now 36 hours since Mark Zuckerberg appeared on video. So we'll follow where it goes, but nevertheless, it illustrates once again that this idea of free speech is still kind of a controversial idea, at least for many people that come from a leftist point of view. Just before we take a break, though, one of the things I would also want to talk about is on the anniversary of course, January 6th, there was a post that came from the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, in which he was talking about 5 officers who lost their lives. And Andrew McCarthy, who is up until fairly recently supported the fact that Merrick Garland would probably be about the best attorney general you could get, given the fact that Joe Biden's going to obviously have a different viewpoint, really began to say, wait a minute. This is just going beyond the pale. So let me quote from Andrew McCarthy for just a minute. He says, first of all, let's stipulate that Merrick Garland is quite right to castigate all who punched, tackled, tased, chemically attacked, or otherwise assaulted police officers. But, he says, again, maybe Donald Trump would be making a big mistake if he were to allow those individuals to be pardoned. But he says, let me actually state for the umpteenth time that no police officers died in the line of duty during the Capitol riot, which, of course, is exactly what was stated by the Attorney General, Merrick Garland. He says, we all know this, but don't take my word for it, because here's his argument. It is a serious felony violation of federal law to murder a federal officer in the line of duty. It is punishable by death or life imprisonment. Federal laws that the Justice Department enforces also severely punish conspiracies and attempts to murder federal officers who are carrying out their official duties. And by recent count, Garland's Department of Justice filed charges against nearly 1,600 people in connection with the events of January 6, 2021. And here's the point. Not a single charge of murder of a federal officer, nor conspiracy or attempt to murder a federal officer was alleged by the Department of Justice. He then goes through some of the stories that we've heard before about this, and then points out again that the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, knows this. The government bears the burden of establishing that criminal acts brought about a murder. That is the reason why the Justice Department never charged, for example, the death of Officer Sicknick, which took place days later, as that. And he said, when finally President Biden nominated Merrick Garland, I said he was the best appointee that those of us who were politically and ideologically opposed to Joe Biden and progressive Democrats could hope for. I was expecting to disagree with him on law enforcement priorities, but at the same time, he said, but based on my experience interacting with him on terrorist prosecutions and a number of other things, I believed he would be an institutionalist regarding the Department of Justice, that he would do his best to shield the Department of Justice from politics and not sully its public legitimacy by making grave allegations he knew were untrue and couldn't be proven. And he ends by simply saying, how wrong I was. So, again, one of the best arguments against some of these comments that keep being made about 5 officers that lost their lives in the line of duty is, if so, why didn't you bring murder charges? The fact that you did not knows very easily you could not prove it. Let's take a break, though. We have a lot more to cover. We'll be back right after this.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, Click on Viewpoints. You'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now. Be informed. Pointofview.net. Click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, we're going to get into a couple of other issues. One that shouldn't surprise you, but probably would be surprising if you hadn't think about it from a biblical point of view, is the issue of criminal justice. This is a booklet we put together a number of years ago, 2019, and again, we'll probably update it as well. A biblical view on criminal justice, in part because it is a topic that deserves some attention, also because at the time, the president, Donald Trump, had been dealing with some of those issues, and there was some criminal justice reform. But most importantly, it just is a Christian issue, as illustrated by the fact that if you look at our booklet, and again, we'd be glad to make that available for those of you who'd like to read it. One of the resources is from one of my chapters on Christian ethics. The others are from Chuck Colson's book on Justice That Restores, or Daniel Van Ness, who used to be with the Justice Fellowship, associated with Prison Fellowship, Daniel Van Ness, Crime and Its Victims. And the bottom line is if you think about the issue of crime and we want to apply a biblical point of view, obviously the penitentiary system and the criminal justice system we have right now fall short in a number of different ways. But this article, and it's the third article we've posted by our friend Cal Thomas, raises another issue. It would be a great way to save money while at the same time implementing maybe a more biblical view of justice. How so? He says, first of all, cutting spending is something that we are hearing right now from Donald Trump and many of his nominees, including, of course, the Department of DOGE, Department of Governmental Efficiency. But he also points out that according to the Sentencing Project, 72% of federal prisoners are serving time for nonviolent offenses and have no history of violence. More than half are drug offenses. Now, as much as it is important for us to deal with this issue and the scourge of drugs, at the same time, there may be a better solution. And it's worth considering for this reason. The United States has more people incarcerated in jails and prisons than any other so-called free nation in the world. Yes, there's some others like, of course, North Korea, Russia, China, whatever. But if we want to compare ourselves to like nations, nothing comes close. He then goes on to point out that according to the Prison Policy Initiative, prisons, jails, and other forms of incarceration hold over 1.9 million people in 1,500 state prisons, 98 federal prisons, 3,000 local jails, 1,300 juvenile correction facilities, 142 immigration detention facilities, which we were alluding to just a minute ago, even 80 Indian county jails, as well as military prisons and all sorts of other things, state psychiatric hospitals, at a cost of $182 billion each year. Now, if you just look at the prison system, the Federal Bureau of Prisons says the cost of caring for an individual's needs in the jails and prisons for the year 2020 was determined to be $39,000. As we look at this right now, considering that the median real income level in the United States for 2029 was $35,000, almost $36,000, it's safe to say that incarceration doesn't pay for anyone, not the offender, not the American community, or the taxpayer. Like everything else, the costs since have likely increased. So using those numbers, you can certainly see the problem. He then actually gives you a reference to the film, The Shawshank Redemption. And if you've never seen that, fascinating story where you, of course, it's fictional, but nevertheless has Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman and the rest. But there's a line in which Andy Dufresne says, "The funny thing is, on the outside, I was an honest man, straight as an arrow, had to come to prison to be a crook." And there is a sense in which that is the case. Sometimes when we take somebody in there because of a drug offense, they're around other criminals, they don't come out rehabilitated. They come back more recently as a criminal because of recidivism. And so that's something to think about. Cal Thomas suggests maybe there's a better way. That is, nonviolent offenders could wear ankle bracelets and be confined at home, saving money and offering opportunities for real reform. And he points out that if you look at the Old Testament law, and again, I don't always want to have a one-to-one comparison between the laws given in the Old Testament for the Israelite and the Israeli theocracy and say that all of those have to be applied in the 21st century. They should not. I think we have to do some serious work of understanding the principles and seeing how they apply in the 21st century. That being said, though, one of the overarching principles in the Old Testament is the model of restitution. And he argues that that model of restitution would not only force the offender to pay back the victim for money or property that was stolen, but in itself invokes a notion of personal responsibility for one's crimes. The victim in these circumstances is not so much the state as the individual. Depriving one of liberty for a property or drug crime does not help the victim. And he says, I have known and know now people who have been subjected to an unjust system that includes sentence disparity and lengthy periods of incarceration, benefiting neither the public nor the prisoner. That prison reform has not been on the top 10 issues for Republicans is no reason it can't be added now. Saving money and redeeming a system that no longer benefits the incarcerated or the public is a winning issue. Rather than the Republicans' tough-on-crime approach of the past, a new approach is needed for the nonviolent offender because it results in something that would be helpful, and that should be a goal rather than political posturing. And he does make the case that prison sentencing reform is ready-made for bipartisanship and the incoming Trump administration to try it and invite Democrats to join in it. And so in here, I do talk about some of these very important biblical principles. There are at least two. One is retribution, and the other is restitution. Now, what is retribution? Well, retribution is the act of punishing a criminal, and that is known as the lex talionis that we have in the Old Testament. And you find that in Exodus 21. You find it in Leviticus 24. You also see other regulations in the Mosaic Code, Deuteronomy 19, Deuteronomy 22, Deuteronomy 25, to mention a few. So we recognize that an individual should be punished for a crime that he or she committed. And that, I think, is the idea of retribution. But there is another principle here, and that is the principle of restitution. And it does seem to me that that biblical principle sometimes is missing. And we see that in Exodus 21, verses 18, all the way to Exodus 22, verse 17, where, again, the fines were not paid by the government. The offender paid the victim. And so it seems to me that that is very important. And again, these principles that we apply in the public sphere, I think also apply in the private sphere. For example, in Isaiah 1, verse 17, it instructs us to learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. You can also go to Micah 6:8, which we quoted a couple of weeks ago in one of our interviews. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. So it seems to me that this idea of restitution is really important. And while we're talking about the criminal justice system, let me have a shout out to all of you that have been involved in some kind of prison ministries, because let's face it, if we're expecting the institution of the penitentiary to actually have people want to have penance and really begin to change their behavior and as a result become rehabilitated, the best rehabilitation program that has ever existed is found in God's Word. And so I think that these very important ministries, of course, we just mentioned One Prison Fellowship a minute ago, and many others are all very important ways to address that. And in the past, we've even on this program had a criminologist who's been at Baylor University, Dr. Byron Johnson, who has written, I think, the best book on the subject, More God, Less Crime, in which he made the case that, again, these prison ministries and other prison programs, sometimes, as we've talked about in the past, implemented by wardens and others in the prisons, have really been able to provide necessary life skills, education, but also biblical conversion. And so if we're interested in a criminal justice system that is based upon biblical principles, we've got a lot of work to do. If you'd like to know what that means, here's this booklet. Again, I'd be glad to make it available to you. Probably going to update it in light of some of the conversations that will be taking place in this next administration, but this is one on a biblical view on criminal justice. And again, feel free to contact us if you'd like to get a copy. When we come back, We Can Handle the Truth. That is a piece by Christopher Roach. I'll explain more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you want to go to the website, this is our fourth article, We Can Handle the Truth. Easy to find because it's got a picture of Jack Nicholson, of course, making the statement, you can't handle the truth, and this is written by Christopher Roach. But right beneath it is one I wanted to point you to as well, a trip to Greece with the Aegean Sea Cruise, because earlier in the first hour I did mention the fact that we do have a trip going to Greece May 17th to the 27th. 7th. I've had a couple people call and they'd say, well, I'd like to kind of see what it involves. And so even before you would receive something in the mail, you can actually click on that button there that says Trip to Greece. What you'll see then is, first of all, the first page has all sorts of pictures giving you an idea of where we would go. Then 3 pages of the itinerary with kind of a breakdown of what would be happening in each location. Then a final page there that talks about different costs. And some of those are variable because some people, especially when we get on the boat, want to have one kind of room or another one. So you can do the calculations. But if you wanted to find out more about our trip to Greece, go to the website, pointofview.net. There is a button that says See More. Scroll all the way to the bottom, and you will see then information about the trip to Greece. It's a PDF. You can print it out, or you can just read it online. Of course, we can mail something to you, but for those of you that have access to a computer, and I would assume most of you do, you could actually check that out right there. And of course, I know we had a couple of phone calls about the trip to Greece, so if you'd like to know more, you can go to the website right now because Karen's posted that for you to read as well. Let's just, before we wind down, talk about this idea of we can handle the truth. And Christopher Roach looks at 3 different issues. One that we've already mentioned, and that is how political correctness sometimes distorts the way in which the news media covers an event. And the example that he uses is what we just talked about over a week ago, and that is what happened in New Orleans. And that is, we could see that here is a man with an ISIS flag on his truck who actually ran over pedestrians and then shot it out with the police and announced his intentions even on social media. But we had difficulty getting the mainstream press to even acknowledge that there was a driver in the truck, much less that the driver actually was a terrorist. And one of the things that Christopher Roach says is, look, a 3rd grade kid could figure out it was Islamic terrorism. And the fact that you had at least one FBI agent and then even a local police officer that just couldn't bring themselves to refer to it as a terrorist attack, I think illustrates again that we are trying to say to the media and to the government, we can handle the truth. And there is this attempt oftentimes to prevent people from really getting a chance to see the truth, which brings us to something I've been wanting to talk about for days, because his second article is what's been going on in the UK. That is, you have had these Palestinian gangs. They've been referred to as rape gangs in the UK. And there has been, really for years, a willingness not only on the part of the media, but police, even some politicians, social workers, and others, to downplay the reality of these attacks. Well, it got back in the news because of, well, no surprise there, Elon Musk, who, again, called for the British government to investigate these matters. And as he points out, this is again, Christopher Roach points out, when these stories first came to light in 2014, so we're talking about 10 years now, the media and politicians were really concerned about a backlash. And he says, defending the authorities' atrocious handling, you had one British writer, Tom Holland, who said, not the one that we've interviewed here, the true nightmare of Rotterdam is the motives of those who turned a blind eye. However monstrous the consequences were indeed noble. In other words, it was noble that they didn't want to cause maybe a backlash or a reaction to Muslims generally. But by not covering this, you did more harm than is good. And as a result, these rape gangs, as they've been referred to, or even other phraseology has been used as well, has been something that has been going on literally for a decade and only now seems to be covered. And as he points out, it was even the fear of being accused of racism that he thinks could even have resulted in the 9/11 attacks, because The gate agent at the time did not want to stereotype the Arab men carrying box cutters. And so we've had so many examples of where we said, look, we don't want there to be Islamophobia. And I understand that. But at the same time, this fear of being labeled as racist, homophobic, Islamophobic, whatever it might be, has kept us from honestly speaking the truth. And as, again, Christopher Roach says, we can handle the truth. His last one brings us all the way back to the theme that's sort of run through this week, and that is the issue of free speech and democracy, because he says under the emerging ethos of safety, authorities treat information and speech as things that need to be curated or maybe managed or controlled to prevent the dangers of prejudice. And the dominant ideology conceives of the public as parochial, tempestuous, and easily seduced by bad speech. And so as a result, there has been this argument, will we just for your own good have to regulate speech? And of course, we're now starting to see Mark Zuckerberg and others saying, well, maybe we need to back off from that a little bit. We'll see how serious X becomes and how serious a variety of things like Facebook and Meta become, but we'll see. So far, so good, at least with Elon Musk. But again, Christopher Roach ends by making this case. Self-government is not possible if the people are deprived of facts from authorities. Democratic self-government does not even have an obvious value if we also think the voters are too stupid, easily misled, or prone to spasms of emotional hatred to govern themselves. Far from hateful, he says, Americans, Britons, and Westerners in general are remarkably fair-minded. Because of a deep-seated tradition of individualism, we are adverse to judging others as part of groups or mistreating them because of their crimes or other issues. And he points out that the leadership class really has no respect for the West, its history, and its people, and this is evidenced by their consistent desire to hide the truth and subject our most vulnerable citizens to all sorts of horrific violence, lest we all get the wrong idea. They have forfeited their authority to rule because of their repeated refusal to treat us with candor and protect our most valuable and vulnerable citizens. Contrary to their prejudice, we can handle the truth. So this really brings together three things. One, of course, we talked about New Orleans. Number two, of course, we've talked about censorship, but this gives me an occasion to talk about this ongoing grooming scandal or gang rape scandal in England that, again, hasn't been covered, can you believe it, since 2014. Here we are in 2025. More than 10 years. So that is our last article. But again, if you'd like to find some of the other articles or information about the book we talked about in the first hour, the California Left Coast Survivor's Guide, all available at our website, pointofview.net. Most importantly, I want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. And I hope that you'll take the time to maybe find some of these articles, maybe post them on your website, maybe start a discussion even around the dinner table, because these are issues vital to the future of this country. We'll take a break. We'll see you back here tomorrow on our Millennial Roundtable right here on Point of View.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.